Next section, section number 12, covers the American Civil Rights Movement. So your American Civil Rights Movement, in order to really cover the whole thing, you could teach an entire class just about this one subject. And certainly, even all the way predating the Civil War, predating Reconstruction, there's people that are interested in modifying civil rights as it applies to black people in the United States. But for our purposes here, we're really going to look at the kind of classical American civil rights movement. You close your eyes and you think about certain images that pop in there when you think American civil rights. You think Martin Luther King's speech in Washington, D.C., lunch counters and things like that. And that's really the time period we're talking about. But just be well advised that this is kind of an arbitrary time period that I've selected, and selected for very good reason, but it really doesn't do the subject justice in its entirety. And because we're talking about subjects of violence, because we're talking about subjects of race, things of that nature, there are some extremely graphic and horrible photographs, ideas, and things like that in this presentation. So you get the standard disclaimer to be mindful of that as we go forward and pay attention to the historical story, and don't let the emotion of the thing, although it's there, override your study of this very important part of American history. So as I've said before in other lectures, you really have to be careful of pointing to one single event in time or dealing with ideas where you would argue that this particular event, whatever the event happens to be, makes something else inevitable. And history doesn't really work that way. There's too many moving parts, there's too many personalities, and it's just too complicated. That having been said, there are still moments in history where you can go back and you can look at something that happened and you can see a clear ripple effect, and you can see how strongly one event focuses attention either in one direction or another, or you have a great deal of sympathy for something or an event or a person, what have you, and that has a tremendous influence on history. When we're talking about the American Civil Rights Movement, too many people tend to point straight to Rosa Parks as a convenient jumping off place. And while that is certainly part of the story and certainly is important, there's something that happens before Rosa Parks that really, really has a tremendous effect on galvanizing people's reactions and driving the beginning of the kind of classic era of the American Civil Rights Movement. And that is the murder of a little boy in Mississippi, and the boy's name is Emmett Till. And you can see him there on the left-hand side. He's just a young guy. And what happens is Till is from Chicago, and so he comes down to the deep south in Mississippi to visit some friends of his, like Mr. Parker and Williams there. And because Emmett Till is from Chicago, he doesn't have the same kind of experience, social experience of Jim Crow in the South that everybody else does. So he's staying with these friends and relatives, and ends up getting tangled up in this story that eventually culminates in his death. And there's a lot of unfortunate parts in this, but it really plays a major role in driving forward this whole drama. So on one afternoon in August, Till and some of his friends go into a little grocery store in Money, Mississippi. And the grocery store is owned by the Bryant family. It's a young white couple, live in the neighborhood. They've been there for a long time, and they've got this basic grocery store where you can go. It's more like a convenience store today, right? So you can go in there and get candy or what have you. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're going in there to get some little snacks, and depending on who you talk to, depending on who was interviewed, Till said something to Bryant's wife, a woman named Carolyn Bryant. And something that you might have said to somebody in Chicago would not carry the same social importance that it would carry in a place like Money, Mississippi. So whatever Till said, it was reported to the husband as inappropriate. The wife claimed that he had wolf whistled at her, and touched her on his way out of the store. And in a place like Money, Mississippi, this is behavior that would meet with retribution, extreme amounts of violence. There would definitely be a response to it as an assault against the established social order, just on its own merits, above anything else. And again, we're not talking about the issue of right or wrong here. Murder is wrong, and certainly killing somebody for making a wolf whistle at your wife is just beyond the pale. But there's a lot more going on here. So after Carolyn Bryant tells the husband, whose name is Roy, he goes and gets his friend, J.W. Millam, and they go out to the farm and they abduct Emmett Till. Beat him up, kick him around a little bit, and they eventually kill him. And the photograph you see there, the barn on the left, is where it happened. And they tie the body to a cotton gin fan, wrap some barbed wire around his neck and barbed wire around the fan, and then they chuck him in the river. And the thing that you have to really remember is this is not entirely out of the ordinary. To see this kind of violence take place in the Deep South, it's not really that novel. Kind of brutal violence, I mean, we've discussed it in form of lynchings and everything else before, is par for the course in preserving these little bits of social structure. And they have been for many, many years. This is the location that the body was found. It was discovered by a local fisherman. All that you could see were parts of the 2 feet sticking out of the water. And again, what makes this truly out of the ordinary and makes it so historically noteworthy is not the violence. It's not the fact that it was a kid. It's not that it was racial violence. It's really what happens in the wake of this murder that makes it something everyone should know about and everyone should understand. So after the body is removed from the river, it is returned by rail to Chicago for burial, and his mother, named Mamie, accepts the body, and instead of ordering a closed casket, orders an open casket with a kind of a glass top to it so you could see the body, and then encourages all these different newspapers and magazines to come and photograph the condition of the corpse. She has photographs of herself taken. There's these really gut-wrenching photographs of her when they're taking the casket off of the train, and she's kind of falling down and almost in fits, and rightly so. It's her child. But all of these are kind of gut-wrenching photographs, and this whole series of photographs kind of gets out there in the public consciousness. And this is really what she wants. She wants people to see what's physically been done here. And you can pretty much imagine, the condition that this body would be in after having been beaten and then dropped into a river in summer in the Deep South. So you're not dealing with something that's really pretty. It's going to be shocking. It's going to be horrible, to the point of almost ghoulishness. But that's the point, is to draw attention to just what's happened here and what kind of conditions or what kind of social conditions that people are being confronted with in the Deep South, in the American South. And Mamie Till makes sure these photographs get reproduced and articles written about them. Jet Magazine picks up the article, picks up the photographs, and literally tens of thousands of people attend the funeral. And at the funeral, all of these tens of thousands of people file past the casket, and they see this kind of hideously bloated and degraded corpse, just destroyed from being exposed to these conditions. And there is a massive public outcry. People everywhere demand that something is being done. Not because it's a horrible thing, but because they've kind of had their nose rubbed in it. It's difficult to ignore when the photographs are in these popular national magazines. And there's these photographs of this mother, and everyone can identify with somebody's mother being just completely destroyed by the death of her child. Not just death, but this kind of horrible, brutal murder that's taken place. So as public attention, nationwide attention shifts to this murder, people begin to demand that something be done about it, and it leads to an actual criminal trial. Now, just because there's a criminal trial does not mean that the issue gets resolved in kind of a justifiable or appropriate way. It's not that difficult to figure out who is responsible for the murder. Bryant and Millam are charged with murder, and witnesses are called, evidence is presented, but the outcome of the trial is essentially what everyone can guess. So before the jury is dismissed to deliberate on the guilt or innocence of these two men, the attorney tells them to do their white Anglo-Saxon duty, whatever that means, and the jury is gone for 1 hour. One of the jurors interviewed later by a reporter said that they chose 1 hour because they wanted to make it look good so that they didn't just leave the room and come back. But they took long enough to socialize and drink a Coca-Cola amongst themselves. And then they came back, of course, and found Bryant and Millam not guilty of the crime. And here in this photograph, you can see them. They're kind of celebrating. Carolyn Bryant's over there on the left-hand side, and Roy Bryant's on the far left. And they've gotten the outcome, of course, that they expected and they were hoping for, not guilty. Within 1 year, the Bryants sell the story to Look magazine, and in the article that's written in Look magazine, they admit to the whole affair. They admit to the murder, dumping the body, the whole bit. But because in the United States we have double jeopardy laws, the Bryants and Millam are not, you cannot charge them with a crime for the second time. They've already been acquitted, and so they're safe from any new murder charges. All of the people that are directly involved with the murder of Emmett Till are dead, with the exception of Carol Bryant. On the left, you can see, Carolyn Bryant. You can see her on the left-hand side there. That's 1955. And there's another more recent photograph of her taken in 2012 on the right-hand side. She was recently interviewed by this historian, Timothy Tyson, for his book, The Blood of Emmett Till, which has just been released. It's 2-3 months old, something like that. And in this book, she admits certain things. She admits that Till never touched her or propositioned her, although he did wolf whistle. So she has lied about some of the particulars of the case. Really doesn't change any of the outcome. This is still one of those very clear miscarriages of justice. This is what's left of the Bryant Grocery today. The building, or what's left of the building, I should say, is still standing. And there's a concerted effort to turn it into some kind of a national historic site or preserve it for historic purposes. Now, the situation that revolves around the murder of Till is so profoundly disturbing, so incredibly graphic, and so incredibly public that it has a rippling effect. And there are other people who are inspired or galvanized, if you will, to action because of what they see happening or not happening in the case of Emmett Till. And, you know, your most classic example of this is Rosa Parks. There's absolutely no coincidence that Rosa Parks decides to perform her act of civil disobedience on that Montgomery bus in December of 1955. So you've got just a few months later people beginning to act out in terms of civil disobedience because they've seen this kind of tragedy and a horrible thing taking place. And a lot of times I would argue that Rosa Parks gets the lion's share of the credit for beginning this kind of great forward momentum in the American civil rights movement, because she seems like a very safe figure. She's kind of a short woman and is a woman, and so it's easy to kind of transfer mythology to her and to make her out to be this great figure, and kind of a timid figure that would never be involved with this. She just, kind of has this sudden moment where everything has to change, and that's about as far away from the truth as can possibly be. Rosa Parks was not a very timid person. She actually later gets involved with the Black nationalism movement. She was a gun owner and a staunch supporter of the Second Amendment and believed that black people should arm themselves. This is not the traditional narrative we get of Rosa Parks as kind of this little old lady type figure that makes this great dramatic stand. There's quite a bit more to her than meets the eye. But you can begin to see how this huge event of this Emmett Till murder and later the trial and everything has a fallout that is picked up by other people. In response to Rosa Parks, there is a sustained bus boycott, and the real significance of the bus boycott is, obviously you're trying to affect change, and that's true, but the real significance is that it gives rise to the careers of lots of people that go on to major importance in the civil rights movement. You also get the foundation of lots of these different, kind of an alphabet soup of organizations that go on to have major importance in the civil rights movement. Things like the SCLC, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SNCC, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and later, much later, is CORE, which is the Congress of Race Relations. It's less important to memorize the specifics of the alphabet soup of organizations, but to know that in their beginning, they're dedicated to the idea of using nonviolent civil disobedience to effect change. And this is very important because it actually provides a fundamental base from which all of the later movement spreads. And in these early days, you see figures like Ralph Abernathy and, of course, Martin Luther King begin to gain prominence as figures that are turned to for interviews, sound bites, to articulate the philosophy of the civil rights movement. And in these days, it is very much centered on nonviolence. So it is not about, starting a riot or burning a bus, but about sitting at a counter and willing to take the abuse and take the name calling and everything else that goes along with it in order to effect change, to bring these ideas to the public, exactly like Rosa Parks did. There's also a change in the stance of the United States government at this time, and it is a very slow, excruciating process. But in 1954, there's a court case called Brown versus Board of Education, and this is something you absolutely need to be familiar with, where the parents of Linda Brown, who's over there on the left-hand side, is told she cannot attend a certain school because of segregation laws. And under Earl Warren, the U.S. Supreme Court decides that this is unconstitutional. And so this whole platform of separate but equal that has existed through the entire Jim Crow era, right up into the time period we're talking about, begins to, the foundation of this begins to crack. And what it does is it provides a foothold for people in the civil rights movement to begin to set up test cases where they can bring segregation of schools into federal courtrooms, away from state legislatures, away from state courts, where they can begin to make change at the federal level. And not just segregation of schools, but buses and everything else. And we'll see that as we go along. But it starts right here in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education, and this is school segregation, public school segregation made illegal. First big test of this happens in 1957. The NAACP registers 9 kids who go on to become known colloquially as the Little Rock Nine at Central High School in Little Rock. And the governor, Orville Faubus, who's the guy behind the microphone indicated by the arrow, goes on this tirade about how he will not let this happen. It's not going to be his state. He's going to protect civilization, and just about every other kind of thing you can think about somebody in his position saying, right? And what happens is the governor turns to the Arkansas National Guard and calls in the National Guard to basically set up a cordon and protect the school from integration, to serve as quite literally a blockade between these 9 students who are trying to enroll in the all-white high school and this process of desegregation. And this creates a standoff between the state of Arkansas, the federal government, the protesters, and the NAACP. And eventually it gets to a point where it's so unsustainable as a public issue that Eisenhower, then President Eisenhower, federalizes the National Guard, removes them from the situation, and sends in United States Army troops to basically force desegregation of Central High School. And that's exactly what happens on the 27th of September 1957. You have United States military troops literally protecting the 9 students, providing armed guards and armed escorts for the cars as they carpool them from collection points or from their homes to the school, and then escorting them up the steps into the classrooms. And the group that is sent in is the 101st Airborne. These are elite troops. They're paratroopers. They have a much higher level of training than general infantry. And so their presence there is sending a statement in and of itself. And you can see how the front of this high school has almost been turned into kind of a military camp with all the vehicles and weapons and everything else. And there is some minor unrest in the community, kind of minor violence, minor rioting. A couple of people get attacked. The paratroopers are ordered to disperse the crowds, get rid of the rioters, and dispel the protesters. And that's exactly what's going on in these photographs. So you see these paratroopers they have their bayonets mounted, and they're kind of in a big line, and they're just forcing these people down the street. They're not shooting anybody, they're not lobbing tear gas, but they're, clearly compelling them to leave. And notice one thing in the left-hand photograph, those 2 girls are grinning, they're smiling and laughing. So this is not, this kind of photograph has great propaganda potential. If you are a segregationist and you do not believe that black people should be allowed into these all-white schools, then you can use this as an example of how your own personal rights are being trod upon by the federal government, because they are, assaulting the dignity of women with rifles and bayonets and et cetera, except for the fact that these girls are clearly not in any mortal danger. I mean, they're kind of giggling and laughing. It's probably the most entertaining thing that's happened to them since prom night, but that's neither here nor there. So even in the other photograph, these guys are walking away. It's not developed into a major fist fight. And what this demonstrates is that the federal government will desegregate, even if it means they have to use force in the form of United States troops to do so. Next real major attempt at desegregation is through interstate buses. And this follows the success of sit-ins, and I'm not providing you with slides of all of that. It's in the reading. Again, if I stop to talk about all of the minor pieces, we'd never be able to get through this, or this presentation would be 4 hours long or something crazy like that. So make sure you do the readings. The sit-ins and the desegregation of city facilities and public high schools and things like that is proceeding at a fair clip. But desegregating interstate buses is a place where you can cause this conflict and get it into a federal court because it's an interstate issue. So the federal government has that right to step in and deal with these issues that travel from state to state. So they can keep the issue of these segregated buses away from a state court that is obviously going to be sympathetic to the status quo. All right, the desegregation of interstate buses is a major test to Jim Crow. It brings attention to this established social order. It disrupts the norm. It brings the attention that is needed to these issues to begin to make change. The best example of this is what's called the Freedom Rides. This is 1961, and it is a combined effort between the SNCC and CORE, where they're putting college students on these buses and they're going to send them from the north into the deep south. The buses start in Washington, D.C., and they head kind of south and west, and their final destination is way, way in the deep south, places like Birmingham, Alabama. And the last stop that the buses make before entering Alabama was actually in a little tiny town about 18 miles west of Atlanta called Villa Rica. And in Villa Rica is where the buses turn straight south and then head, physically into Alabama. And you can see the routes of some of these buses in this map here. The first bus is actually stopped in the town of Anniston, Alabama. It doesn't even make it to Birmingham. Protesters, rioters, whatever you want to call them, they cut the tires, they throw Molotov cocktails on the bus, they hold the door shut trying to keep the Freedom Riders inside to burn them alive, and it's only because a state trooper who pulls his gun actually happens to be there that the protesters the Freedom Riders on the bus actually survive. Otherwise they'd have been smoke inhalation victims for sure. And this is what you see here in this first photograph. You see some people sitting on the ground. They're kind of coughing, and they've got smoke-damaged clothes. And you see how close they really came to being killed in this bus. The second of the two buses, and this is just a photograph of the first bus, but the second of the two buses actually makes it past this roadblock, makes it all the way to the bus terminal in Birmingham, and the commissioner of police, a man named Bull Connor, and this is a man you need to remember this name because you're going to hear much more about him later. He allows rioters to board the bus and attack the Freedom Riders for 15 full minutes before he dispels the crowd and breaks up the riot. So even though the bus got to Birmingham, the police were complicit in the just absolutely savage attack of the guys and gals that were on the bus making the Freedom Ride. And this man here, Jim Zverg, was one of the Freedom Riders. He was on that second bus, the one that actually made it into Birmingham before it was attacked by that mob. And there's a bit of genius in the Freedom Riders in that the groups that they put on the bus and sent into the South were mixed race volunteers. So Jim Zverg is beaten so badly that he almost dies. You can see the arrow indicates his picture on the front page. He almost died waiting for a taxi to pick him up and take him to the hospital. So all of the black-owned taxis wouldn't come anywhere near the mob in Birmingham for fear for their own lives, and the white-owned taxi companies were complicit in the crime anyway. So it took forever for him to get to the hospital. He does survive, but you can see how badly he's beaten. The genius of using these mixed race volunteers, and I want you to be very clear about what I'm about to say. You can fill a bus with black college students and send it into the South, but it is simply not going to get the same attention in 1961 as a bus full of white and black college students. That doesn't make it right or wrong. That's just a statement of observation. Okay? And that's part of the reason that this is a mixed race group of volunteers, because that image on the right-hand side there of Jim Zverg, bruised and beaten in the hospital, has a tremendous resonance with people that are watching this unfold. Okay, it means something different to a lot of people in the North that are watching this. And I've included a YouTube video of an interview with Zwerg from the hospital bed, where he talks about the value of desegregating these buses and how much it means. And just imagine for a moment hearing that kind of message come out of the mouth of this college student, really not that different age-wise than most of you listening to this right now, and how that would resonate with parents or with elected officials for that matter. Furthermore, it provides evidence that the violence that is associated with preserving the era of Jim Crow, which is already starting to fracture from the legal standpoint, the willingness to preserve this type of society, the violence is not divided anymore. It's no longer directed exclusively at blacks, but it's directed at anyone who is causing degradation or erosion to the social order, established social order, I should say. Going forward, the Attorney General, who happens to be Robert F. Kennedy, forces all Alabama National Guard to protect buses carrying riders state to state. And that's what you see going on. So you go from that top left photograph, which is that first bus stopped in Anniston, to that bottom left photograph, which has a ring of armed National Guardsmen surrounding the bus. And all of those guys have got their gas mask pouches and their bayonets fixed. So they're definitely geared for riot control. I mean, not combat, but riot control. And their job is specifically to prevent another one of these kind of Jim Zwerg type episodes where a mob of people just brutalizes and maybe next time they outright murder somebody over desegregated buses. And this is part of this national outrage. People see Jim Zwerg, they see other college kids that are just riding on a bus, brutalized and beaten and left all bloody in the hospital, and it drives public attention. The president and the attorney general get directly involved with making sure that these buses and making sure these protesters that are going to the South to fight these issues of Jim Crow get protected. Instead of the police being complicit in their abuse, they're protected by federalized troops or members of the National Guard. And this is a later freedom ride. Eventually, this bus, obviously, you can see from the name tag on the very front, its eventual destination is Dallas, Texas, so it's going into the South and then crossing through the entire length of the South. But look at what's going on in that picture. If you stop long enough, you can count at least 10 police officers, 2 police dogs, and this is just for one bus. So the situation has completely and totally changed from one of active antagonization to protection. Immediately prior to 1962, the United States Supreme Court had heard a argument that if it was unconstitutional for public schools to be segregated, that would extend to colleges as well. And they upheld this idea. And Supreme Court in the United States ruled that segregation of college was also illegal. And to test this, the NAACP in 1962 attempted to register this man here, James Meredith, at the University of Mississippi, also called Ole Miss. Now, despite the fact that the Supreme Court of the United States had ruled that segregation was a crime, basically, then Governor Barnett bars Meredith from admittance, registration, whatever you want to call it, to the University of Mississippi. And this starts yet another standoff between a state official, school administrators, state officials, state government, and then the federal government. You can see Meredith is in the center there. He's personally protected by U.S. Marshals. People are beginning to be drawn to the University of Mississippi in small hordes. Huge amounts of people are gathering to protest this. And again, the United States, the federal government, is forced to intervene. The federal government sends in hundreds, literally hundreds of U.S. Marshals to disperse rioters and to protect the university from being destroyed, or burned to the ground, or what have you. And you can see that here. We've got National Guard trucks that are literally carrying in these helmeted U.S. Marshals that are ready with tear gas and gas masks and batons and the whole thing. It's basically the same song and dance yet again, where there's a state official, either at the city level, the county level, or the governor's office level, that is interfering with desegregation, and it creates one of these standoffs that is being, the federal government is then forced to send in either troops, like the 101st Airborne in Little Rock, or U.S. Marshals here at the University of Mississippi. And this event, this riot, several actual big riots that take place on the campus of the University of Mississippi, is interesting because you can see in plain English the fear that people are having about the total erosion and destruction of established social order. So when asked why these rioters are there, one of them replies, to battle against Catholic communist northern intervention in Mississippi white people's business. What does that even mean? There's so many phantom enemies in that statement that it almost loses all value. So what you have are people that are responding out of fear. And I'm not saying that they have, I'm not trying to establish a moral value for any of this. I'm just saying, yet again, think about the value and the power that fear has driving people's reactions. And if you think your society, something that's been in place since the 1890s, is being upended and eroded and completely changed and being destroyed, you're going to be afraid. Doesn't mean that the society is built upon decent moral underpinnings. That's irrelevant. That's for the philosophers to argue. That's not a subject of history. But you can see in this whole idea of the communist Catholic intervention. There's no such thing as a Catholic communist or atheist. It just doesn't make any sense. But you can see the fear coming out in that kind of a response. And here we go again. These are the U.S. Marshals. They're on the steps of the Lyceum. It's a famous building on the University of Mississippi campus. And there's kind of clouds of tear gas. You can see some maybe Molotov cocktails in the background. And these guys have their gas masks on, their batons ready. So again, the federal government is pushed into this kind of reaction to undo this standoff. And it doesn't hold. James Meredith is eventually admitted and goes to class just like a normal college student would. And the significance of this at the University of Mississippi is that the institution of the university is an icon. It is a massive icon of segregation. So when you think about certain colleges, they're known for certain things. In the modern era, it tends to be sports teams and things like that. But one of the things that the University of Mississippi was known for was being this staunch bastion in the 60s, early 60s, was this staunch bastion of segregation. And so when it is forcefully desegregated, it sends a real message out into the world. One journalist is quoted as saying afterwards, he watched this whole riot and he watched James Meredith finally be allowed to go to class, and he said, Ole Miss was the most powerful institution in the entire state. There was no question about that. And once segregation fell at Ole Miss, it was like conquering the highest mountains. He's kind of putting in these poetic, little bit flowery terms, but the idea is still there, that you've achieved something that is overhauling huge social components of society. Also, think about this photograph for a little. a little bit, the students that were in these classes refused to sit in the same rooms or be in the same program as James Meredith. And so this entire argument people made about the destruction of their own culture and the destruction of their ability to get their own education really had nothing to do with James Meredith, because they removed themselves from that equation. And you can see it right here in this photograph. So there's two major things going on here. Number one, it's incredibly significant in James Meredith's life, and that he, will be allowed to attend college and pursue his own goals and aspirations. But it's also significant, not necessarily in terms of him as a person, as a human being, in the story, in the message that it sends about segregation itself. In 1963, much of the attention of the civil rights movement shifted to Birmingham, Alabama. And if there was another place that was heralded as kind of the icon of segregation other than the University of Mississippi, it was Birmingham, Alabama. In fact, so many people had bombs thrown at them or their property destroyed that the nickname for Birmingham had become Bombingham. And prior to coming to Birmingham, all of these kind of alphabet soup of civil rights groups had gotten together, and they had tried to desegregate the city of Albany, Georgia. And they didn't really have clear-cut results. And so they lose a little bit of momentum in 1962 after the desegregation of the University of Mississippi. And so they really want to have a major victory to kind of restart the momentum and the movement and produce a clear victory that really sends a message about the civil rights movement. So they kind of turn their attention to Birmingham. They call the series of demonstrations that are planned for Birmingham Project C, and the C is taken from the word confrontation. And Birmingham is targeted for these two reasons. It's an acknowledged unrepentant area that is protecting segregation, and it is also the place that Bull Connor lives. And we've talked about him just a little bit before, but Bull Connor is reliable in that he will inevitably react to any kind of segregation protest with just kind of increasing amounts of violence and brutality. So he came out of the gate basically with those folks on the Freedom Rides and put Jimsburg in the hospital and beat up all those. He didn't do it himself, but he allowed the protesters to be brutalized. And they know that he will act in this same way over and over and over again. So if you're looking to give your organization, which has a nonviolent face, something to make it appealing, to give it a good image in people's minds, you set it opposite something like the brutality of a man like Bull Connor. And if Bull Connor reacts the way that you expect him to, it'll generate sympathy not just in the North, not even just in the United States, the South included, but it will generate sympathy for your movement the world over. And so they're going to try and capitalize on any violence that the civic authority through Bull Connor is produced. And one of the key features that they use in Project C is a lot of children. They specifically bring in a lot of young kids to be part of this because they're trying to make that emotional punch. They're trying to get that image out there in the media. So on the 2nd of May, 1963, there's a march in Birmingham. And Bull Connor, and you can see he's in that photograph on the upper right-hand side. He's the one that's pointing his finger at the camera and yelling something that probably can't be printed in mixed company, but that's neither here nor there. Of these protesters, Bull Connor has 959 children between the ages of 6 and into their mid-teens arrested and thrown in jail. And on the 3rd of May, more protesters come back. There's more children with this group, but there's no way that the police can handle a second demonstration of this size. So thousands more protesters, including some children, come back for another demonstration the very next day, and the available space in the jails is maxed out. There's no other place that the police can arrest any more protesters and put them into jail. So what Bull Connor does is he orders the fire department to come and turn their hoses on the protesters, just kind of blast them into the street. And this image of firefighters hitting these protesters with a high-pressure water hose is not the image that the United States government wants to see. It is not the image that the United States government wants to try and defend in the court of world opinion. So through all of this that we're talking about, you have to remember that there's something going on in the background at all times, and that's the Cold War. This give and take that we've talked about between the Soviet Union and the United States. And all of this stuff that is going on with the civil rights movement has an impact, correlation back and forth with what's going on with the Cold War. And this image right here is not something that the United States wants to have a debate about with Soviet Russia, because it makes the United States look bad. It's very difficult to defend this kind of behavior to someone that is using it to kind of poke fun at, or not poke fun at, but to kind of show that your culture is not as sophisticated and as advanced as someone else's. So this is also not the kind of image you expect. When you close your mind and you think about a firefighter, you think about somebody who is running toward the flames, carrying people to safety, saving people's lives, doing all this righteous stuff, not somebody who's turning a fire hose on a bunch of little kids in the street. So there's a lot of problems with what people are seeing coming out of these protests in the media. And when the fire hoses don't work, Connor orders police dogs to help break up the demonstration. And all of this, as planned by the civil rights organizers, takes place in full view of the media that dutifully report it all over the world. And people are legitimately shocked when they see people, children really, rolling down the street under these high-pressure hoses. But they're sickened and horrified when they see people being attacked by dogs. This is not the kind of behavior you expect out of a police officer. A police officer is, the servant of the public. It even says so on the car. It says serve and protect, right? Not we turn dogs on you because we filled up our jail with children. It creates an untenable environment politically for the United States to operate in. And at a base level, what really makes a lot of change is the local businesses in Birmingham. They're watching all of this take place, and this is happening in downtown Birmingham, right in the major business district. And by the end of May, the local businesses are terrified of the consequences of this continued hostility, because there's now a presence of federal troops. Because they have to end this. This cannot continue to go on, right? I mean, it's kind of the natural order of these things. There's these protests, there's a state response, and the federal government sends in troops. Same song and dance. But these local businesses are worried about what's going to happen when they're not going to be able to make money in this environment. It's going to kill them. It's going to drive the city of Birmingham back into the Stone Age, basically. And so they essentially give in to the majority of the demands of the civil rights protesters. And this is the desegregation of buses, lunch counters, public parks. It's the standard kind of things that protesters were interested in. They just achieve it all through this one huge media moment, through the use of these protests in early May. And through all of this, Birmingham Police Department manages to make themselves look like a bunch of uncouth savages. And this image of the police in the South being a bunch of, one step above cavemen, comes out of this era. I mean, this is a pretty, think about this image right there. This, the deputy in the middle there is kind of saying hello there to the world, but think about the image that this puts out there for everybody to see. And how damaging this is to go out there in the media. And really, the behavior of the Birmingham police does wonders to make themselves and police all over the South look bad. And you have to think about this. This is 1963, and we've already talked about the space race. Something very important happened in 1963, right? So the Soviet Union put Valentina Tereshkova into space. So in 1963, you have the Birmingham Police Department, men that are sworn to protect the city and protect the citizens, acting like this in public with absolutely no shame. Meanwhile, you have the Soviet Union with its totalitarian communist government exercising more equality than what you see here. So they're exercising, and that's one of the arguments the Soviet Union makes, is look at how open and equal our society, this great communist society is. We're able to put a female into a spaceship and send her away to do these great scientific things and make the human race look good. And what are you doing? You're busy attacking people with dogs, and you've got the police that can't seem to get their heads screwed on straight. So this really leaves an incredibly bad taste in people's mouths in terms of this process of segregation. And the fallout from this is Bull Connor loses his job. In fact, not only does he lose his job, but the entire Birmingham City Commission is done away with. And Birmingham goes from a city commission system to a mayoral system to wipe out this kind of thing that's been allowed to grow in Birmingham. And also in the wake of this total collapse in Birmingham and the savage thing that went on, President Kennedy begins serious work on real federal civil rights legislation. So it's taken all of this chaos from the 1950s to the mid-1960s for the federal government to begin to consider producing laws to make changes rather than just sending in the troops when things get completely knucking futs and everything is coming off the rails and these city and state governments are going crazy about segregation. So the success of Project C in Birmingham really truly elevates Martin Luther King to the great and legendary status that he still holds in American history today. And just months after Birmingham, Martin Luther King delivers his famous I Have a Dream speech during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This is in August of '63. And historians generally credit the national reaction to these kind of this litany of outrages perpetrated by Bull Connor and his goons in Birmingham, and this March on Washington, which is a very public, very emotionally gut-wrenching moment, with providing the moral and social capital for passing the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and later the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And those two acts are passed under the Johnson administration. We'll get to that in a second. And when I say social capital, I mean the attention and desires of the public, the electorate, tends to be fickle. So over time, they'll get distracted by something else, or something will become a bigger issue in their mind. So right here in this moment in 1963, there's a tremendous spotlight shown on this issue of desegregation and racial injustice, etc., etc. And it's because of Bull Connor, not Bill Connor. Bull Connor, and then again this kind of emotional outpouring that happens around this dream speech. And the reason that President Johnson, is the one that actually sees the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act through is because Kennedy is assassinated in '63. So of course dead people don't write laws, but before his assassination, Kennedy had claimed to a reporter that the civil rights movement should thank God himself for Bull Connor, because he's helped it as much as Abraham Lincoln. So everyone understood that there was a major emotional component to this, and that the civil rights movement had played public opinion and the media incredibly well. and to their own advantage, and rightly so. So, with the death of JFK, there's a massive public outcrying of support for the government. And this happens every single time a president is assassinated or injured. You see it over and over and over again. And it's I kind of describe it like this. So think about your own family, right? You got brothers and sisters, or, aunts, uncles, cousins, whatever. And you can't stand to be around your brother or sister, your aunt, uncle, cousins, whatever. And they've got all these annoying habits, and you don't like them, and they're terrible people. But then you go into some place and somebody else says those same things about your family, and next thing you know, you're fighting mad that they're talking smack about your family. Same kind of idea. Americans we like to complain about the president. We feel it's almost our moral obligation to do so. But if something happens to that man, then we all get incredibly pissed off. Think about it like the public reaction that happened after September 11th, right? You had Democrats and Republicans out there on the steps of the Capitol building holding hands, singing together. I mean, good God, can you imagine that today with the recent election? I mean, everyone is just at each other's throats right now. But this is kind of the reaction. So the death of Kennedy generates a massive amount of social and political capital that Johnson can use to pass these acts. And that's what they do. He makes these major changes in terms of civil rights in the United States, Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. And basically, you're doing away with discrimination based upon race and a number of other special categories, and gender, etc., etc. And these are becoming enshrined in law. We don't need to go over the exact particulars, but just that these take place. Also think about it. You really haven't had major changes to civil rights in the United States going all the way back to Reconstruction. So really what has been required is the effort of all of these civil rights figures, from Martin Luther King right on down to the lowliest freedom rider, the Jim Zwergs and everybody else. But it also required the death of two presidents to provide enough political capital for changes to be made in this country. It's just an interesting thing to think about. When I say two presidents, I'm talking about Lincoln and Kennedy. So in 1964, 1965, we've got these voting rights and civil rights acts, and everything changes. Problem goes away. We no longer have any issues to worry about with race in the United States. That's wonderful. Except it doesn't really happen that way. It doesn't even come close to beginning to solve the overall problem. In fact, there's plenty of fighting that hasn't even gotten started yet. And a good example of that I can show you comes from a man named Lester Maddox. He operated what was called the Pickwick Cafeteria right here in Atlanta, Georgia. And it was one of these basic places where you would go in and get your tray and walk up and down the line, and then they would kind of put food out for you. And he's one of these guys that revolts to the idea of these civil rights legislation as an attack on his own personal rights. And he gets incredibly upset and refuses to follow any of these new laws, any of these new regulations in terms of his restaurant. He continues to bar black people from coming in and eating there. And Maddox becomes a very popular figure in these segregationist circles, although he doesn't call himself that. He calls them integrationists. And he gets famous for throwing people out of his cafeteria at gunpoint. You can see that right-hand arrow is pointing at a little revolver he's got in his hand. And also chasing them out with an axe handle. They were famous for axe handles. And he actually makes quite a bit of money selling signed axe handles and selling them to his, adoring fans. It'd be like you going to the ballpark and getting some major league ball player to take a Sharpie and sign his name to the bat. The same kind of idea. He's making this souvenir and marketing them. So Maddox actually goes so far as to close his cafeteria, closes his business, rather than integrate and follow the law. He sells all of these bats. He sells all kind of crazy souvenirs. He has a whole line of pressed metal license plates with the rebel flag on them that says "I stand with the Pick Rick" and all kind of things like that. And he fashions himself this persona as someone who's a martyr, who's been persecuted himself, and almost sometimes using to the point of quasi-religious imagery, not calling himself a saint or anything like that, but kind of alluding to that with the use of these words, that there's something to, major and emotional going on with his experience. And you can see on that left-hand side, there's this guy, a mannequin dressed in a business suit, and he's labeled American Free Enterprise, and he's been stabbed in the back. And so Maddox is making the point here that the United States government, through this civil rights legislation, is stabbing America in the back. They're stabbing free enterprise, private property, freedom, and liberty in the back. It's fundamentally, it's circular logic. It's got really quite little basis in reality. It makes no sense if you think about it. But this is, in this way, he's able to fashion this whole new name for himself and get a lot of notoriety by playing on these words and playing with these images of himself as being the victim of the United States government, almost using the same kind of terminology that the American Civil Rights Movement has been using all along, but turning it completely on its head and turning it all the way around. And this kind of visceral gut reaction to the American Civil Rights Act is not some white thing, like white people just everywhere lost their mind or something. After 1965, there's a significant splintering of the American Civil Rights Movement itself, and you see quite a few people begin to move away from this nonviolence, this whole idea of nonviolence that's been the basic foundational ideology for the civil rights movement since really the beginning. And you get a lot of people that are unwilling to accept the 65 acts, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, as an end to the movement. That, yes, this is good, but this isn't a place where we should even be celebrating. We need to achieve more. There needs to be more progress, etc., etc. And you have a whole different image beginning to form. And this image is much more aggressive. It's much more militarized. And when I say militarized, I mean aggressively, has a much more aggressive posture, willing to argue, willing to be loud and angry, rather than nonviolent and to avoid confrontation, except in the ways that we've described with Birmingham, etc., etc. Within these new more aggressive groups and more aggressive personalities is a willingness to use force as a means to compel change. And in the terms of Malcolm X, he believed that that might be quite literally any means necessary. It's a very famous speech he made where he says that black people will be respected as human beings, they're going to be given the rights of human beings, and that they intend, they being the groups, civil rights groups, intend to bring into existence these rights by any means necessary. And it's kind of an unspoken overt threat, right? That violence is absolutely a completely reasonable thing to fall back on in order to achieve these goals. This is completely at the far end of the spectrum than the civil rights movement we've encountered up to this point. And if you think about it, it almost goes all the idea kind of should bring back the arguments of Marcus Garvey to you, right? The idea that you've focused on the rise of black culture, extreme self-sufficiency, what's called black nationalism. And so it's really a separate culture that is able to sustain itself, able to take care of itself, not integration, equality with a different meaning, really. And from the rise of black nationalism and these ideas about
aggression and self-sufficiency, you see the rise of things like the Black Panther Party, and there's plenty of other more aggressive parties. The Black Panther Party just tends to get a lot of the press, and these groups are certainly much more aggressive in terms of defending voter rights, organizing the protection of neighborhoods, things like that. Along with the rise of black nationalism, you also see a sustained defense of the Second Amendment. In fact, the National Rifle Association, the NRA, helps to establish several charters for armed branches of civil rights organizations. One of the big ones is actually formed by Robert F. Williams, who's a member of the NAACP, and he actually gets thrown out of the organization because he is intent on arming and training members of the NAACP. Williams writes a book which is titled Negroes with Guns, and it's a defense of the Second Amendment, the idea that everyone has this constitutional right to have weapons. They have this right to weapons, and that these weapons should be used for self-defense. And this is alarming for a lot of people, the idea of these extremely aggressive verbally and politically groups arming themselves with weapons, but it goes back to that idea of we have the same rights as everybody else, and we can meet this violence with violence. It's almost our moral prerogative to do so. And as an aside, there's this modern perception of gun rights groups like the NRA, that the NRA is a organization dedicated to the preservation of firearms in the hands of white citizens and not black citizens, and the history of it just doesn't support that. It's just not true. There's been a long series of instances where people in fringe groups, whether they be racial minorities or social minorities, have embraced the Second Amendment as a source of social and political power. I would argue that the most recent would be the gay rights groups that have formed within the last 8 years, are almost following in exactly the same sort of political argument that you would see made by Williams in terms of everyone having the same right, regardless of race, gender, sexuality, to these kinds of methods of self-defense, and the ability to meet someone who means you deadly violence with, a protection. You can protect yourself. And these ideas about black nationalism arming itself, black nationalism, and the Second Amendment are seen as extremely dangerous, extremely subversive. And Williams is actually hounded right out of the country into what is basically political exile for these beliefs and these things that he's arguing. And of course, you should almost have seen this coming. He is accepted almost immediately by international communism. So the USSR and Communist China are always ready to make social and moral observations about the life in the United States, particularly in the 1960s. And so when a figure like this is available for an amazing propaganda op, like he is here meeting Mao Zedong, and here is Mao is handing him a signed copy of the Little Red Book, which is all of the little communist ideas that came out of Chairman Mao's brain, and it becomes yet another way for the Soviet Union and communism in general to kind of box the United States about the ears in terms of politics and society. As there's a rise in more militant examples of civil rights or the struggle for civil rights, you also get, on the flip side, a much more concerted effort to preserve these traditional ways of life. And you can see it in the fact that Lester Maddox uses this notoriety and uses his beliefs as a springboard, and actually propels him into the governor's office in Georgia. And Maddox is a marketing genius. He uses all of this controversy and all of these fears to propel himself into this political position. and uses it as you would expect. In 1968, when Martin Luther King is assassinated, Governor Maddox refuses to allow the body of King to repose in the state rotunda. It's a simple thing. It's a minor thing, but it's just one more in a long series of kind of segregationist acts that come out of people like Maddox. Just continuing right on out of the 1960s, almost right into the 1970s. And by the 1960s, you can see that this split has taken place between the two kind of ideologically opposed camps in the American Civil Rights Movement. So in the top photographs, you can see these armed black men protesting inside and on the steps of the California Capitol. They've got shotguns. They've got some, looks like M1 carbines back in the back. Significant amounts of military kind of bearing. They're wearing black berets and things like that. So it is sending a totally different message and a totally different image than the more open, passive, nonviolent suggestions that are coming from Martin Luther King that you see on the bottom there. And by the mid-1960s, these groups are in opposition to each other and unable to even work together. Even when they have essentially at the bare base, boil it all down to its constituent pieces, they have a very similar goal in terms of civil rights. And it's really impressive to see just exactly what happens. And in these photographs, you can see it as plain as day. The use of force versus the use of language, rhetoric, and emotion. Maddox's popularity did live out the 1960s. He actually ended up being lieutenant governor under Governor Jimmy Carter. Because of a weird quirk in Georgia electoral laws, he ended up as lieutenant governor. And he actually ran for president in 1976, but was unable to marshal enough support for a national campaign. And this really shows the limits, the outer political limits of the regional power that the ideas of being a martyr and someone who stands for, Anglo-Saxon, white, Southern duty and all that other nonsense, and what they can actually achieve in terms of politics. And it's important to remember that you've seen just from 1955 to 1965 a massive change in the United States, and even more so when you consider the rise of black nationalism and all of that. But these issues have not reduced in scope, scale, or importance, emotional impact right on up to this very day. In fact, I would strongly argue that this is probably going to be a continuing issue in the United States for several more generations, just because of the emotions involved, just because of the politics involved.